Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another wonderful episode of the War Report. Now, we have a bit to cover. We are a bit under the week mark. I think it'll be about 5 days since our last episode premiered, but it's just the way the news cycle moves sometimes. We gotta cover this, and rest assured, we will have a show for you at the end of the week as well to cover anything that we may have missed here or any developments that may have happened since. But with that all being said, let's get into the meat and bones of it. So, of course, the elephant in the room that must be addressed is Mariupol. And as we've been reporting for the past few weeks, the city is effectively in Russian hands. And it has been, I don't even know the word I would put it in, just a string of post hoc justification, may I even say cope, coming from especially the Ukrainian side on the loss of the city and what it entails. And of course, there has been the typical media blackout from the Russian perspective, as to be expected. But it looks like this may have some machinations also on top of the capture of Medvedchuk by Ukrainian government forces. Of course, he was the leader of the now banned largest opposition party For Life and was noted for his allegedly close relationship with both Putin and the Russian government. Now, how true those allegations are, we not really relevant at this particular moment, but that is worth putting out there. So you have the city effectively in Russian hands, and it looks like the speculation about a re-strategization in order to secure the east of the country has come to fruition after you saw the initial withdrawals from, for example, Kiev. And it looks like, as has been the case since pretty early on in the war, Russia is now solidifying its control over the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, where, again, a lot of it is still up in the air, but a lot of people would have you believe either out of misinformation or, oh, there's that word, misinformation, or outright manipulation and malice that, again, just columns of Russian armor stacked 10 tanks high because the plucky Ukrainian fighters with their anti tank weapons are just fighting the good fight, fighting a real guerrilla war, as one does. But I think the situation doesn't quite match reality, especially with the Avastal facility, as has been a major focus in the news for the past couple weeks here. We mentioned it last episode with the alleged underground basements and what is called to be the affected defeat of the Azov battalion, and some are wondering how the defeat of the more, let's just say, hardline groups will affect the decisions of the central government in Kiev. However, this also is on top of the news that negotiations have once again stalled out between the two countries in terms of reaching some sort of, if not peace, at least ceasefire. But I know once again you are chomping at the bit, so I'll leave it to you.
Well, you mentioned Medvedchuk, and the Ukrainians had a story that he had escaped, and then they recaught him. And one of the stories about his escape that he had fled to Russia, but it looks like, especially when you look at photos of him, it looks like he's always been in their custody the whole time. Um, they made similar ridiculous claims way back when the war started. As you recall, the day after the invasion, representatives of Zelensky's administration met with Putin's administration to discuss peace terms, to discuss, way to end this war, to meet the demands for Donetsk, and to recognize Crimea, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the guys on the board, I forget his name. Now he was a banker, and um, they had a story that he had valiantly like fought off some Russian marauder, all kinds of ridiculous stories. They call anybody on the streets of Kiev when like the main Russian force was like 40 kilometers out. Um, Marauder. Recall that Zelensky gave everybody guns and he let men out of prison with guns to act as an extra force. That's how panicked they were. And different gangs started to form up. Um, and all kinds of casualties happened as a result. Anyways, this guy later was killed, and they finally admitted that they had killed him. They shot him through the heart, and there was a mayor that they executed as well that they suspected was sympathetic to the Russians. And then people wonder like about Bucha because basically any of these poor farmers, who exchanged food or I don't know what, were considered collaborators. And then you have that footage that surfaced about, it would have been April 5th or 6th, where they're just beating the hell out of civilians in Irpin, which is another suburb just north of Bucha. So it's a very kind of paranoid state, and it's been that way for a very long time, stretching back at least to 2014. And in some areas of Ukraine, frankly, it's been longer than that, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, when a lot of these groups who were in many ways liquidated by 53, 54, began to resurface again. And, I mean, they worked closely initially with MI6 in the mid-century, and then, frankly, but as soon as the Soviet Union was dissolved, they reemerged. So anyways, kind of paranoia still exists there. So there is a precedent. I frankly don't know whether Medvedchuk is going to survive. I don't think he will. Uh, Recall also that the weeks before the end, they have a history of arresting journalists, killing politicians, killing journalists, closing down like every single canard thrown at Russia. They like are even worse at. Um, and I'm not idealizing Russia because, of course, I would say some amount of pressure, but they do have like the Moscow Times, which is owned by the London Times, and they're quite critical. And before there used to be more of those kinds of publications. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
for example, I've noticed from a lot of Russian nationalists,
so
even ones who have warmed up on Putin, that he's still much too soft on, especially foreign-funded opposition.
yes, yes, exactly. Um, there Yeah, I don't always understand the reasoning. Like, you could take an organization like Lambada, which is this like polling thing, this polling company that is Western based. They reveal a poll that percent of the Russian population, particularly the POWs who were executed in videos that they posted, that Ukrainian soldiers posted. Um, Putin's popularity went to 83% from 71. And that had been at 60% before the invasion. So it's really, it's like I said last week about the book is giving him a mandate. And it's a political stratagem, right? Like well, that's what the people want. That's what I do, right? He's clever. So Medvedchuk actually said that, and take this with a grain of salt. They're preparing an exchange fund for someone important in Mariupol. Now, throughout the war, the Russians have been very reticent about what kind of information. But when they do, I think it's fairly honest. Like when they reveal that they lost over 1,800 personnel carriers and armored personnel, uh, and several helicopters. Now, I've seen footage of their helicopters staying on there's nobody in them, but they're getting blasted to bits. So, but generally speaking, the Russians can be quite trustworthy when they do speak. I haven't heard the Russians say anything like that. I haven't echo what Medvedchuk is saying, but they have said that they have detected at least 6 different foreign languages in Mariupol. Now, the mercenaries. My guess is, of course, English and French are definitely in there, definitely English. Swedish, maybe German is quite high. Turkish, Georgian, also pretty high,
Polish,
especially
Croatian.
Georgian. And a little backstory about the Georgian. Yes, apparently Mariupol had 200 Croatian volunteers there. I haven't heard about them escaping, and there have been many attempts at escape. Not the least of which today we've had another number of, we've had several numbers of um, Azov and Ukrainian Marines surrendering, somewhere roughly between 125 to 175, something like that. I saw another figure of 43 that came later. Then I saw, like, frankly, a figure I'm skeptical of 1,000. Uh, it's best to just wait on this stuff to figure out like how many. But they have made pleas. The girlfriends, wives, and mothers of Azov and Marines stuck in Azovstal steelworks, which even has like place where they burn coal. Like it's a really, apparently it's this huge complex, and it has many. It has like 8 floors. I've seen, Joaquin Flores is saying that there's like 20 kilometers, which reminds me of the airport battles that took place in Donetsk. That thing had like 2 or 3 kilometers underground that like led to another town. So um, the Ukrainians could get arms from that town, walk the kilometers underground unharmed, and then they would appear in the airport. So far, I don't see anything like that. They've really like that potential could be there, but no one is getting through. And there was a column that tried to escape late last night, so the 11th, or it could have been very early morning hours on Earth, but artillery and aircraft knocked it down. It was a call about 3 tanks, a few trucks, 5 armored personnel carrier, and about 52 combatants were killed in the process. Then there was a van uh, of Azov guys trying to escape, and they were also killed. And so there's more and more desperation. And like I say, there's all these videos that are addressed to Zelensky, but the Marines and Azov battalion stuck inside the Azov, not just, I mean, kind of given up on making pleas, but they're very, very upset with the leadership. However, they've not mentioned Zelensky in all of this. Now, I don't know if that's because they presume that Medvedchuk is saying, as I said earlier, that there's an exchange, some kind of a fund is being created. Honestly, I think that, that it's not the success that which does bring me to another point. So, Putin could not have done this in 2014 because Russia was not uh, as resilient against sanctions, or it was more prone to sanctions then. Had it desperately tried to maintain not helping those people except for food and medicine. And that is true. They did do that, and their convoys were inspected by Western journalists and by Ukrainian authorities. Didn't actually supply weapons. They did, and lots of Russians did join the fight. Um, but there is, I think, one moment that is similar to this one that had Putin been tougher in some ways, it might have changed that he's engaged in now. And that is back at 2015 in January, and I think it ended just in the first few days of February. There was a battle that took place in Steppe, and it's a town located between Donetsk and Lugansk. I believe it also has this huge train yard and everything, right? And it was a way that, like, if you held that, it made transporting supplies between Lugansk and Donetsk very difficult. They would have to find routes to go all the way around to avoid this area. But it was also, by occupying it, you left yourself open to being stuck in a cauldron. And Debaltseve changed hands at least once or twice. However, at the beginning of 2015, it was the last time that they went there. Now, there were thousands and thousands of troops, and there were many reports emanating from there that they were retired Western military personnel, embedded volunteers and mercenaries from all over the world. I mean, that Swedish guy Skillet was not there, but he always boasted of how many Russians he sniped, and he was there right at the beginning of the war. So what Merkel did is she flew directly to Putin. She asked for a secret meeting, and I think I mentioned this on the last show, and that's how Minsk Accord or Minsk Agreement 1 was formed. It was essentially to save their lives. Now, had that happened, had like Putin said no, okay, there would have been more sanctions, but maybe not the sanctions that we are seeing now. Because, of course, there was a bloodbath that took place in 2014, and that was at Yavusk, and those guys that tried to flee from there, they got annihilated. And I believe this was either August or September of 2014. So, uh, uh, had the have Lugansk people eliminated those guys, like in a big way. Of course, they would have gotten Debaltseve, but then the argument is, could they have gone further? Because they would have eliminated so many that maybe they could have retaken Slavyansk. Maybe Kharkov. Kharkov is very big, though. So I don't know about that. And in many ways, Slavyansk is kind of small and difficult to defend. But I will say that that might have made some kind of a difference. Now, we would still be where we are now, but maybe it could have gotten them more confidence. They made another push at Mariupol, but before this offensive in Debaltseve, which did not work, in order to try to retake it. So, anyways, just something to think about. But all to say, I don't think Putin is going to go along with this. I could be wrong. I could be very disappointed as well. But I think he wants to make maximal hay out of this. And he is going to want to parade these guys in the next, 6, 7, 8 weeks when the court proceedings for some of these captured soldiers is going to begin. There have been mercenaries that have been just killed on the spot. They were always told that that would happen to them. There's a British mercenary that has given up today, and if you're on Telegram, you can find this stuff. he was weeping, and because he knows that, like, if he goes to court, he could get a death sentence. I now, like I say, Putin, in many ways, is can be very soft. In many ways, he can always opt for like a diplomatic solution. I don't think that's going to be the case for the general concern for the war. I think he knows that he has to come up with a substantial victory, or politically he's finished. Uh, the people are behind him,
Oh,
and
so
frankly,
the
there have been too
Erdogan
many
dilemma.
losses.
How funny how this works out. It is rather reminiscent of the situation in Syria. However, I will say, for the time being, I have much more confidence in Putin to pull off some sort of substantial victory, even if it is just all manipulation and word games, to the point where it could at least convince a bulk of the Russian public that they succeeded at something. I have more confidence in him than Erdogan at this point, but it is funny how often this trap springs up for so many leaders across so many different eras in just about anywhere in the world you can imagine.
Yeah, yeah. So uh, I I think he's going to go through with. And if there are, I know there are foreign fighters, volunteers, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, that are there, and frankly, Putin can't just. I don't think he can just kill them outright. They're going to have to go to court first. They were told not to go. And it won't be just one or two; it'll be many. So, does that mean like, uh, you know, intelligence there to leave them behind? Like, even a few weeks before Russia invaded, and the UK both moved their embassies to Lviv or Lvov. Um, and so, maybe some. I know that the Canadians trained with them beginning in 2015 in Mariupol. There could be Canadian volunteers, sure, um, and that could, a few intelligence assets that are there. Um, there have been even more attempts to. We've been 5 helicopters that have been blown out. There were 2 or 3, which was 2 weeks ago. 2 more the boat uh, that had the Maltese flag, but it was actually Turkish owned, that tried to. That didn't work. It was part of a caravan that pulled way. They fired on it. No one was killed, but yeah, they gave up. And that many people who were, in a sense, they were hostages. They couldn't leave the boats for weeks and weeks, but they weren't hostages by either the Ukrainian Marines or Azov. You know, I would say they were in danger, but less in danger than apartment buildings. And I don't know if people have seen the videos where the Azov guys up inside a room, and inside one of these buildings, and they know if they go, well, it's us, but you're going to take 20 of your own, because that's the way they looked at it. They always understood, towns like Slavyansk, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, um, around just west of the Donetsk and Lugansk area, they weren't wanted. You know, People went along. Um, so, the situation in Mariupol, I think we're going to find out very soon. You know, I think probably in the next 48 hours we're going to find out what's actually there. In some of the pleas uh, from even the Azov battalion commander, they're saying that they're running out of ammunition and they're running out of food. A lot of these guys look in bad shape. So, you know, next 48, we're going to know if there's intelligence. Now, it could be that Azov has decided to kill some of these intelligence officers and dispose of their bodies somehow. Uh, Maybe that happened early on, and it'll be difficult to find them. We don't know. Macron called about a week and a half ago to speak to Putin. That did not go well. Um, and then he called again recently. Might have been last Friday. That also hasn't worked. So, you know, this region, I think it's over. Like the Russians are going to get Donetsk and Lugansk, the whole of them. And now the question remains what to do with the 70,000 that are just on the edge of those territories and on the western flank of those territories. And the bombing hasn't stopped. That's been going on. Artillery fire has been going on. The Pentagon has reported that Russia is flying about 250 sorties a day, uh, which isn't that much, but it's a
Well, the
lot.
question is, the Pentagon lowballing
Kiev,
us or highballing us? That's the real question, I would say.
yeah. You do have to think about that. Now, there was a small column that tried to get to this area uh, from from Kiev, which was knocked out. Again, the Russians now do have air superiority. The drones that the Ukrainians are using now are not effective. They're getting knocked out. So a lot of that early success isn't there anymore. Uh, and frankly, it's just not a lot. Like they don't have movement. A lot of their reserves of oil, diesel, and even their refineries for these things are being destroyed. Another a tractor plant that was impromptu used to repair tanks has been destroyed in the Kharkov region. So, one of the issues that that the fighters in Mariupol have had was, why haven't you come to save us? And you can see why, because now there's this vast kind of empty space, the Donbass to the Dnieper River, and it might seem that nothing is going to happen to you, but because there's air supremacy, you're going to get knocked out. And so Kiev is very hesitant about moving out the majority of its troops. It's like close to 100,000 in Kiev. The reason they're afraid is because they're afraid that Russia can go right back to those areas. And in fact, some of the artillery fire that's been firing on these areas in this area east of the Dnieper River, they're firing from areas very close to where Kiev is. These are semi-contested zones, but more on the east flank where old Kiev is. So it, you know, uh, uh, you're seeing also more kind of somber news from the West. I saw some headlines saying we should not think that Ukraine is going to inevitably have a victory. Mariupol is essentially fallen, and what I just said about Kiev demonstrates that the feint that the Russians went for by pretending that they were going to invade Odessa and Kiev fixed those groups in there, and now they have no control over the air, uh, no significant amount of resources to remain mobile, and they cannot save the enormous amount of troops that I would say, if you count Mariupol, the Donbass, and Kharkov is probably safe to say 140 to 150,000 troops. Now, Mariupol is gone. They estimated between 14 to 20,000. That's down to probably about 1,000, maybe 1,500. So
Yes.
it doesn't leave much, and they're slowly picking off the troop, their the Ukrainian troops, particularly their artillery. And the thing with artillery, right, is once you lose artillery, the artillery that's firing on you now doesn't have to like shoot and then evacuate that area because it's going to give their positions away. Now they can stay in those positions because there's nothing you have that can reach them. So that changes the battle in a very permanent kind of way.
And I want to bring something up because you mentioned the, let's just say, the media war surrounding this. So you have the media already, and they've been doing this for a few weeks, souring on the idea of the brave Ukrainian fighters taking back their country from the Russian menace, from punching the bear directly in the nose and living to tell the tale. It looks like they are trying to quietly lay that to rest so they can move on and generate a new narrative. And you already see that happening in real time because Biden has been making what can only be called inflammatory comments regarding Russia's conduct in the war, breaking out the G word, the genocide war, as we will call it for YouTube friendly terms, and alleging the Russians of it. Now, typically, if you were to apply this narrative to, say, a country that the U.S. would have been more than capable of pushing around, say, Iraq, Syria, Serbia, Afghanistan, etc., it would imply that they are gearing up for an intervention there. They're gearing up to convince the population that it's our sacred humanitarian duty to intervene on behalf of these people. However, you are getting what we've seen in the past years. I think we saw a lot of this under Trump, particularly when it came to Iran, and even more so under Biden, where it is this hard, inflammatory rhetoric, yet the actions on the ground by the American empire point to anything but that going to be the case, where it looks like at this point, and I've maintained this since the outbreak of the conflict, that the Western powers, no matter how big of a game they talk, have no real intention of getting involved, no matter what propaganda they put out there, no matter what narrative they spin. It is purely to, again, it's to morally grandstand and try to win a narrative war while Russia is winning an actual conflict. And that doesn't surprise me. And of course, this is just mere weeks after Biden made the comments about Putin being removed from power before immediately backtracking on that and causing immediate frenzy. So the narrative out of Washington and Brussels, etc., has been muddled to say the least, and it looks like
Mhm.
that they want to avoid this as much as possible. They're trying to rile up the population once again, walking this tightrope by now calling it the Putin price hike. They're calling the rates of inflation
Yeah.
the Putler's price hike. Like I believe it was also what was it, Putler's gas tax or something, or gas hiker. One of these, again, it's almost word for word recycled what they did here, where at this point, I know it's a common trope that empires love to scapegoat foreign enemies for domestic problems, but they're doing it in one of the most ham-fisted and least creative way possible. Because when you look at China, which we do have a little bit of news about China we can get into, or you look at Russia or Iran or any of these countries, any of these so-called bad guy countries, when they say what they do about the American empire, there is a kernel of truth to it, and they present it in a much more coherent way. Of course, they don't show all their cards right away, but it's understood that they have something of a plan to counter what the American empire is doing to them. And look, it's a propaganda tool. I get it. I can't even be that outraged about it on either side, really. But it doesn't feel like when the regime's talking heads, whether that be Biden, whether that be Psaki, whether that be Pelosi, or any of these people, or even people from the opposition, from the Republican side, get up and say this stuff, it does sound like they're just blowing hot air, that they're talking completely from nowhere that they have no intention of backing up these words or doing anything substantial with that, which I'm not complaining, but I just do have to point out how foolish it looks, and once again, it shows how fragile the American empire is in so many ways. Now, once again, I will reiterate, I do not believe the American empire is on the brink of collapse, but it is sure as hell in a situation it doesn't want to be.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I've had I've had friends, Ukrainian friends, who've said like, um, why won't Putin like let Russians see the reports, like, or coming from, let's say, the BBC or CNN? And I just think like, do you actually realize like they like canceled all this Russian media first, and the Russians then 2 3 days later canceled their media? Like, do you understand that? And then, I would point out like things, you brought up genocide earlier. There's this old, there's a channel that the Netherlands and Soros and the US embassy funded called Hromadske, Hromadske TV. And I've seen like this like crazy general saying we have to kill these people, and then you have like a journalist, Bogdan Butkevich, who says, we don't need to understand Donbass. We need to understand Ukrainian national interest. Donbass must be exploited as a resource, which it is. At least 1.5 million people are superfluous. No matter how cruel it may sound, there is a certain category of people who must be exterminated. And you can still find that on Wikipedia, right? So like, I would tell them, do you understand, like, Russians, that's what they see? Like, you have never once asked me, what are the Russians seeing? Like, you got like, the amount of hubris you have as a Westerner is outrageous. I mean, these aren't even people to you. Like, you haven't even considered these things, right? They're looking at a completely different resource of information, and they've been looking at it for 8 years. Like, what do you think? Like, you think you're gonna like convince them? Like, sure, there's a number of them who don't want any war, and if and there is, I think, in Russia, well, I would say up until recently, a kind of looking up to, as far as the West in America goes, although that is dwindling more and more. Like, the liberal class in Russia is finished right now. It's over. Um, so I was also listening to an excellent episode that our friend on Telegram gave us, between Tim Kelly, and Tim Kelly's a great guy. He used to do stuff with well, he did stuff with Jay Dyer, but also with Joaquin Flores way back in 2014. He was on this strange YouTube channel that Herbal Remedies, but once a week they would have a show. I have no idea how I found out about that, but that's how I found out
Well,
about
that's
Tim
back when the
Kelly.
algorithm actually used to let you find interesting things.
Yes, good point. And Mike of Strike and Mike was on, and he brought up some interesting facts that I had no idea about, with Russia, and basically kind of the tug of war that has been going on. But I mean, Putin has won this with the oligarchs, and that is Chabayas. People made a big deal about Chabayas. Chabayas is on the sustainable blah 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 department of, like, it's a know nothing department. Russia doesn't take that stuff very seriously at all. Um, and now it doesn't have to. Now there's no global pressure for Russia to even pay attention to it anymore. Anyhow, Chabayas left. He resigned. He's gone, and he was one of these oligarchs who had a government position, since the '90s. And then people made like a big deal about Abramovich. Like, 60% of Abramovich's holdings are all in Western banks. Like, they're not in Russia. He doesn't live in Russia, and Abramovich will shut up. He's going to be quiet because I think now it's very clear that after this war, and this is why we saw dozens of them leaving on March the 9th and 10th, and that is they know there's no room for them anymore. Like, they don't have any direct political power, and now that is over. Like, you can have a nice life, you can be rich, you can enjoy that, and that's all you're going to have. I mean, um, even other things like when the Chechen War was going on, there was a Jewish Congress in Russia, and there was only about 200,000 Jews in Russia, but this Jewish Congress was like it was a secular Congress, it wasn't Orthodox, and they criticized Putin on the war in Chechnya, and that was it. He broke off relations with them. You don't hear about them
Yeah,
anymore.
it's just the
Now,
typical, let's just say, global liberal NGO, and it just so happens that I'm not saying it's a just so happen, but this one is of a particular Jewish flavor, a bit more on the nose, no pun intended, than some of these other ones, but serves fundamentally the same purpose.
right, right, and you know, so the which was it? Times of Israel had a kind of sympathetic piece on Chabad. It's stuck between a rock and a hard place in Russia. Oh, we don't. I mean, to some extent, they're sincere. They don't. It's a religious community. I guess they don't want war under any circumstances. But on the other hand, I don't completely believe them. Um, but there are Orthodox Jewish communities that are actually like in in a sense like the Amish, where they're
Yeah,
they're against
there's
war.
and it's funny you'll see them at demonstrations with Palestinian flags, and
That's right.
that
I've
again
been
that's
to those
that's not
demonstrations.
to defend their eschatological beliefs because I have many criticisms of that, but again they are what you'd expect of, say, Jews of a 19th century and before fashion, where they do live in their quarter of the city, and while they may be a bit of a nuisance from time to time, they prefer to be an insular community. And you see several of those in New York. I believe in New York, particularly the Hasidic ones, and they're even a problem in Israel because they form these insular communities where that they have to send in authorities to break up from the more mainstream Jewish community, and they also dodge
Yeah.
conscription, where the point where they were actually kicked out of some parts of Israel, making Israel the 110th country. But that's that's
Oh
a
my God.
that's aside the point. But point being is, like, although there is a striking amount of unity within that group, there are outliers to be found. Don't get us wrong.
Right, right, right. And so so the Times of Israel wrote this very sympathetic piece last week. Uh, you know, uh, feeling sorry for them, blah blah blah. Well, I mean that's just the way it's going to go. Kuhardorsky was another guy that um, this is from the interview with Tim Kelly and Mike. Um, it was like he was sent to be governor of Kamchatka or the Chuchki Republic. This is like extreme eastern Siberia, close to Alaska. And he begged after 5 years to be relieved of his duty. And then he fled after that. So it is kind of a case where the state has power over over the oligarchs or over the capitalist or over
Once again, I
whatever
would
you want to
call it a
call them.
19th century arrangement where, sure, it's not entirely autocratic, but there is a strong central figure who can crack a whip on these people to an extent.
Right, right, right. And I don't want to belabor this point, but also our friend on Telegram sent me a reply to a post by Andrew Joyce. Andrew Joyce is the guy who, about a week or two after I said, um, he said after a week or two after I said that, for like the average Russian boomer, like the Nazis are bad because they killed them, not because like why Western people
Not
come to
because of the
that
civic religion
conclusion.
that developed in the West post World War II, thanks to Hollywood and the media.
Right,
It's
right.
it's a much different civic religion that was, you could say, in part fabricated by the Soviet government in order to again form
Yes,
a
yes,
nascent
and
national
that's
identity. But
partly, I think, why they don't want to completely
yeah,
let go of it, and they know they can get like a certain amount of political power by using it on the international stage, right?
I'll
But
show you
at the
guys the
same
image again.
time,
This is your average Russian boomer right here. I think you know what image I'm talking
yeah,
about. But with that
right.
being
But then
said,
you
go
have
on.
guys like, yeah, you have guys like Jürgen Graf, who was like this um, Swiss teacher. He was an interrogator for refugees in Switzerland, and then he wrote some revisionist books about the Holocaust, and you know about he was sentenced to 15 months in jail. This is in 98. It would be much more severe now. And he fled to Iran because Iran has a lot of revisionist writers, let's say. And then he went to Russia. He moved to Moscow, and he's been there for 22 years. Like, he's not going to be locked up or extradited or anything like that. Um, but I will admit that the Russians do play this game where and then you have Lavrov, who will who will tell the EU, like, you're overemphasizing the Holocaust and Jewish victims, and you're ignoring the other victims. He's done that on a couple of occasions very recently. So, anyways, we're going way off
Yeah,
topic.
much like I believe it was Zyuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, who said that 75 years ago we defeated the Germans and saved the Jews, Gypsies, and I believe he said other undesirables or something along that line. But that's the Russian boomer mindset in regard to it. And again, not to belabor the point,
Yeah.
I do have a few other stories, also just keeping within European news. It appears to be this has been kicked around for a while. Finland, for sure, and possibly Sweden are both set to begin the NATO ascension process full steam ahead come the summer. And this, of course, is in response to the invasion. You already had, let's just say, some more firebrand figures. Of course, not Zhirinovsky because he has passed away since last episode, as we did announce. But again, people of his ilk and people of, just to say, his mindset, talking about rolling over Finland and Sweden. So again, I wouldn't anticipate a conflict between Russia and, again, say the Nordic states because of that. But with that being said, it does look like that NATO is really trying to project this strength. Of course, they've been, more unified than ever, as they'll always tell you, despite all evidence to the contrary. So they want to add two more token states that, let's just say, are probably more effective than, North Macedonia and Montenegro, but at the end of the day, certainly aren't another France, Germany, or UK, or dare I even say US. But with that being said, I do believe it gets down to the root of what a lot of people have gotten wrong about this conflict and what a lot of people have not understood about this conflict. Because, with that being said, the reason, at least from what I've gathered, Russia did not want Ukraine to join NATO. Of course, there is just the strategic reasons, such as it being directly on the border. However, you could make the argument with the Baltic states, albeit they're much smaller and would have much less influence in Ukraine in that geopolitical context, or, say even Georgia, is although the Russians were not happy about the ascension of states like Romania, Czechia, Slovakia, Poland into NATO, it was painful, but they could tolerate it.
Yeah.
Ukraine joining NATO was a direct declaration on what is mythologically, and I use that term not to say it's false, but mythologically isn't like a widely held civic or even metaphysical belief of the Russian homeland, Kiev being the mother of Russian cities. They viewed it as fundamentally taking a core piece of Russia away from it and integrating it, not even keeping it neutral, but integrating it into their bloc. And I do believe that was the true red line. Now, Georgia, you could say that was a bit preemptive, or you could say that was, I wouldn't say this, but you could even say that was paranoia on Russia's part, or maybe even a show of force after 2008, or maybe in order to prevent or possibly delay the Ukrainian situation, which I think that last one is the most likely. But Ukraine was the last straw because for virtually all of Russian history, it has been this core piece of Russia. Now, it has been the hinterlands, of course. The origin of the word Ukrainian does come from that of land on the border, but again, it has so much both strategic and symbolic significance to Russia that they weren't going to tolerate that. Sure, they probably won't be happy if Finland actually does put its money where its mouth is and go through with NATO, but it's not that same fundamental strike against Russian history and identity that Ukraine is. And I think a lot of people miss that. A lot of people want to be reductionist. Like, for example, when the invasion broke out and people were under this impression that Russia was going to annex the entirety of the Ukraine, saying, well, if Russia doesn't want to border with NATO, then why are they pushing the border westward? Just these real stupid gotcha arguments, completely missing the point about the role of Ukraine within the Russian mythos, as it were.
Right, right. Yeah, I think not only did Putin not want this war, I don't think I don't think even the consequences of the Maidan coup is what he wanted. Ultimately, there was negligence on his part, and that's why this happened. And the rumors are that when the coup happened in February, and the protesters had been in Kiev since like late November. And the funny thing is after the Maidan coup, the protesters were still there, uh, arguing about corruption. But the organizers, the fundraisers, Soros was in the Open Society was one of the major NGOs. They disappeared, and of course, when the cops came in to get the diehards that were there that were against corruption, and not necessarily Pravi sector, uh, well, they were cleared out, no problem. But I don't think Putin wanted this. I think what Putin wanted was like this Ukraine that would be uh, happy to be part of, the Brotherhood and of Eastern Slavs, and we've said it many times on the show. Belt and Road was a project that had been announced in Almaty in August 2013, and I mean he could see that was the future, and it would be a better future for them. But again, I think there was a certain amount of negligence. Also, I think every oligarch in Ukraine got a region of their own, right? And oligarchs in Russia in 2000, 18 of the 19 were of the tribe, and now they account for less than 10%. And that kind of willingness to deal with that issue didn't happen, primarily because Ukraine is a very divided country, and those oligarchs could, of course, like Kolomoisky, get the support of nationalists like Pravi Sector, um, like ADAR. ADAR is one of the first groups that he funded, and these guys are real brutes. Um, anyhow, so that process never happened there, and like I said, it was too divided of a country. And I suppose that was Russia's saving grace, that it was not as divided. Um, Ukraine, I think, the other great channel people should check out is Jonathan Pohl. Jonathan Pohl on YouTube has really, really good neutral history of that region. He's descendant from Volga Germans himself. His wife, I believe, is Russian. He has lived there. He's lived in Kazakhstan. He's a he's a he's an excellent resource. and he did a really great breakdown of a kind of a rapid history of Ukraine from the 1700s or late 1600s, and then gradually with more detail as he came to the modern era, the World War II era and the era just after it. But yeah, that kind of thing never happened in Ukraine, and like I say, the reason for it is because it was always divided, and the West always wanted this. I think Putin would have been very happy if people in Ukraine could have gotten along, and they wouldn't seizing Crimea would not have been necessary. Recognizing the Donbass Republic would not have been necessary. But the fact is that after '91, and especially if you watch the Jonathan Poll or the latest installment, I know it's a bit cringe. Oliver Stone's because he's kind of this. I mean, I like old classic leftists that still care about the working class, but there's some stuff that's
They
like,
they have their priors. They're still to some degree. They may be so-called heretics, but they still have some genuine belief in the civic religion that is off-putting. I understand what you're getting at there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The whole it does. Let's just say it doesn't go into as much detail as Jonathan Poll's video does, which is a shorter. It's just a guy talking to a camera in his living room. So it's very different. But both are. I would suggest watching both because they're very educational. Um, so the division was easy to exploit, and despite the division, Ukraine was still important to Russia, as you say, on a metaphysical level, but also, on an economic level. This was their biggest trading partner. Um, but I think, the outcome of this war it will not make Putin happy. It is a it will be a bitter sweet victory. And the reason I say that is at the end of it, Ukraine will not be united. And I think the vast majority of people that will be glad to be part of Russia will be people that are like Russian or identify as Russian, even if they're not, or they're of mixed Russian heritage. So the original project, didn't really work. Force had to be used. So on some level, um, this split will resonate for many, many decades. And what that'll mean after the war, I don't know. Now, insurgencies in Ukraine, people like to point out that they were squashed. Like World War II, in many ways, took care of a lot of the groups that were at each other's throats. So the Ukrainian UON and other nationalists, they, technically they lived in Southeast Poland at the time. That was Polish clay. And, they massacred the Poles. And there was a time where they went after the Jews, then they sided with the Jews. And then, in some ways, the Germans got rid of the JQ question there.
Well, yes,
The
and
Russians
that was.
divided.
I mean, that's just a story of Polish Galicia and that region of East Galicia, because this happened after World War One. This happened several times until there was an actual, let's just say, setting of solid borders post World War Two. Because as brutal and as bloody as World War Two is, it did homogenize a lot of areas for better and for worse.
It did. It really, really did. And Greeks, Romanians, Hungarians, all those populations decreased. It really has come down to like West Ukrainian, Galician, and Russian. That's what the groups are now, and they lived in more various pockets throughout, right? So the Soviets were like they deported more Poles to Siberia than they did Galician Ukrainians, who were the majority there, right?
Yes, and
That
this
didn't
also
work, right? The
coincided with
resentment, the resentment never went away. What's
with
that?
with the Soviet flirting with Ukrainization, of course. post-Stalin,
Yes.
with both Khrushchev and Brezhnev, two Ukrainians running the Soviet Union for about the second half of its life, and then
Yeah.
you get into even Gorbachev had some Ukrainian heritage as well as Chernenko. So the point being is the post-Stalin Soviet Union wasn't dominated by Ukrainians, but they punched heavy for their weight, to put it in other terms.
Right, right. And there was a real attempt to, to make them happy. But when you listen to the grievances of a lot of modern day Ukrainians, it's like it's almost as if nobody else suffered in Ukraine or the post or the Soviet Union. I hate to say it, right? Even given Crimea, like never appeased them. It was never enough. And like I say, in the 90s, they really started to, and that was partly because the Americans activated them. The Americans began to fund them again after they'd gone dormant for like 35, 40 years.
Yes, and
Uh,
Ukrainian nationalism, even in North America, particularly in diaspora pockets in both Canada, especially, and the U.S., had again, they weren't as influenced as say the Zionist lobby, but they were up there in terms of influence, being these big Soviet dissidents, being the proud Ukrainian patriots who wanted to free their homeland from the boot of communism. They had a very strong selling point, and again, it didn't get to the level even the Cubans had or the Vietnamese, but it was again about a tier below them, so to speak.
right. And one of the precursors that you knew this time was coming was under the Reagan administration. Gorbachev had asked him to visit Russia for Lent, and Reagan refused. And apparently, the reason for this was because of the state of the Uniate Church and the Greek Catholic Church, which is another sort of Rome Catholic affiliated church that is popular with Galician Ukrainians. So that in itself already said that should have been a warning for Gorbachev and whoever came afterwards, that the Americans were already beginning to send signals of who they favor, and eventually that kind of that kind of thinking or concept of Ukraine that was popular in Galician Ukraine became ever more popular throughout Ukraine. But various laws had to be instituted in order that to happen, and guys like Kuchma made that possible as well. But anyhow, we're getting really
Yes, Soviet Ukraine warrants its own episode, which I hope to make happen. Of course, I'll discuss the details with my good friend here off air. But moving on to the French elections, because that also happened this week,
yeah,
we had what was a typical result. So our top four, of course, ended up with Macron at 27%, Le Pen at 23, Mélenchon, the socialist candidate, at 22, and Zemmour, the other right-wing populist, sitting at 7.1, along with various other candidates making up that difference there. You had Zemmour early on in the vote count saying that in round two his supporters should vote for Le Pen, which shows he was probably much more earnest than I originally gave him credit for if he was willing to
yeah,
concede and
yeah,
support Le Pen. Because although, again, Zamora, he was heavily contested in these circles, I was never really sure what to make of him, and I am still not sure what to make of him. But many suggested that he was a splinter candidate to divide the right wing vote coming into
yeah.
the.
That's what I thought.
I mean, I think there's a degree of truth to that, and I don't know, maybe, but for whatever reason, regardless of motive or whatever, he did bow out gracefully and pledge his support and his supporters' time and resources to Le Pen in the election that will be taking place on the 24th. Now, again, this lines up with my pre-war and then last episode's prediction that Macron would come in first in the first round, and he would be facing off against Le Pen in the second round, which I'll be honest, really wasn't that hard of a prediction to make. And you look at the electoral map, which unfortunately I don't have on hand right now, but it was centralized areas, big cities, etc., being won by Macron, and then the countryside being won by Le Pen and Mélenchon. and you could attribute that to economic policy because Le, Marine Le Pen is a very, let's just say, ideologically mixed figure where there's I would call it like a patriotic social liberalism where they aren't ashamed to be French and they're not ashamed to shy away from their culture and heritage, but they're not exactly like the let's just say they're not exactly traditional Catholics in the sense that you would expect a right wing French movement to be, even though again the French history with secularism is a headache in and of itself. Very hard line on immigration restrictions, but also very economically populist. Wants to again not quite a socialistic line. Of course, Mélenchon does skew further to the left on that, but a very, let's just say, left wing populist economic policy. You could almost say, and I don't even want to say this because it is very reductionist, like a Bernie Sanders economic policy, where it is again about maybe not quite equitable. Point being is compared to other populist figures, say a Trump, Farage, Orban, Salvini, etc., skews much more to the left economically than they do. And some speculate a so called red brown coalition, of course, that the liberals always tried to scare us about, that a significant chunk of Mélenchon's more economically minded voters could go for Le Pen just to counter Macron's more neoliberal policy. And of course, this is at the height of an austerity program, Macron trying to increase the work week from a grueling 30 hours. So it shows um, what the cultural mindset is over there. I guess the French are much more Mediterranean than we gave them credit for, but that's aside the point. And with that being said, it is up in the air. I do have a feeling just because the way these things tend to work, that much of Mélenchon's 22% support will go to Macron because they're much more concerned about the so-called, let's just say, anti-hard rightism narrative than they are about their actual economic concerns. But I could see some of the, let's just say, smaller town or rural voters who were attracted to Mélenchon's economic populism default to Le Pen on similar issues as well. But with that being said, I do think we are looking at a repeat of 2017 in the next 2 weeks. Now, I don't think it will be as overwhelming. I do think Macron has done a lot to sabotage himself, not only in the past few months, but over the past 5 years since he's ascended to the office of president. Let's just say that the right wing fantasies of a Jupiterian president unfortunately did not deliver. I know for a while there we had a lot of hope for Macron. Under Trump, he was very transgressive. He was willing to buck the system. He was very useful insofar as that was concerned. But once Biden came around, of course, he defaulted back into the good Eurocrat and neoliberal he was supposed to be. And any hopes of him taking the Jupiterian LARP any further, I would say, dissipated with that. And again, it pains me to say that because I thought Macron, I never thought he was our guy or on our side, but I thought he would be much more useful than he turned out to be. I was really banking on him being a, let's just say, dissenting voice, not even a full dissonant, but just a dissenting voice in the Biden era of the American empire, but unfortunately that did not deliver. And looking at this, I'm not saying that a Le Pen victory is impossible. I think it is much more likely. I think the margins will be much more narrow than they were in 2017. But I'm not banking on it. I think Macron will continue his, let's just say, stumbling on into power because he is a very resilient candidate. He does seem to bounce back a lot because I'm sure you all remember the yellow vest that we covered extensively from 2018 to 2019, where it was about every weekend he was dealing with a full-blown insurrection in the streets of his major cities, even Paris, even the capital city, the heart of France. He was dealing with this insurrection, and he bounced back from that. He had to make some concessions here and there, but it does seem like again, I think resilience is the only word you can put to it. He's faced with a lot of crises, and he always finds a way to, if not come out on top, at least weasel himself into a safe enough position to live to fight another day. And I have a feeling that is going to be the same story yet again. Now, it does raise some interesting questions for the post Macron era. What will 2027 look like? Because I can only imagine what the state of France will be there. You'll recall the 20 retired military officers did write the letter talking about the crisis of immigration and assimilation that drastic action needs to be taken if we're to maintain social stability. Now, how much of that was hot air, how much of that was X, Y, or Z, I really don't know. I don't think exactly the next Napoleon is weighing the wings of those generals, as much as I would hate to say it. Not, that's not necessarily judgment on Napoleon's character, but more of his archetype, more of what, just the centralized autocratic figure. But you guys get the point. You guys get what I'm getting at. But point being is, I think once again, Macron will see a second term that does transition into something that is maybe not necessarily a radical break, but a significant break from the status quo in the coming years, especially with the decline of the American Empire, the state of Europe, the question of what Europe's relationship with Russia will be in the era of the Ukraine conflict, and of course what their relationship with China will be in the era of a rising China. But I do think there a lot of this election will hinge on the progress in eastern Ukraine because it could have a dual sided effect.
Mm.
If Russia is very successful, that could either lead to a disheartenment with NATO where people grow more skeptical, think, is it really worth it? Do we really want to be this bastion against Russia? Are we really going to be put in the meat grinder for the interests of the American empire or whoever? In which case, Le Pen, with the Euroscepticism and the NATO skepticism, that's going to bode well for her. But if it lights this fire under the belly of the French people that we must be the strong defenders of European civilization against the, however they decide to term Russia, whether that be the new Mongol horde, the fascists, the communists, whatever the hell they're going to call them in terms of that propaganda, it could have a rally around the flag effect in which Macron does see a significant boost in support, as he did towards the beginning of the war. So I do think more than any other issue, even if it's not at the forefront of people's minds, subconsciously this election will be decided by Russian progress in eastern Ukraine. And again, a successful Russia could bode either way, but an unsuccessful Russia, I do think, would bode better for Macron because it
Yeah.
shows that our containment policy worked. Our support of the brave Ukrainian people paid off. Look at what I did. Look at what Biden did. Look at what Western leaders can do when we stand together as a united front against tyranny or whatever the claptrap they put out there is. But again, if Russia sees some modicum of success, which they most likely will if the war is to continue on as it is, then I'm really not sure. And I would say that given France's history with NATO being the only country to ever withdraw and return, it holds the record for both. It could bode to a more, let's just say, Eurosceptic and NATO skeptic France.
Yes, I agree with that assessment. That said, on French media, Le Pen has been criticized for being supported directly by Putin in the sense that, well, it's kind of like any dissident right movement, even though she's not dissident right. But the further you go up the ladder, the more anything vaguely right or center gets their alarm bells going. It's kind of like the way Herbert Marcuse said, you have to support any and every left wing movement and every right wing movement. This was like his advice to American intelligence and the CIA. And every right wing movement, whatever it is, must be squashed. So that principle is there and alive very well in the post World War II world of France. Um, so she has been criticized, but when you look at the first round, a lot of people don't care. Most of the people who are going to vote for Macron are 60 and older, 55 and older. That
Yes, the
55,
age demographic is strikingly reversed, especially compared to the Anglosphere when it comes to support for liberalism versus, let's just say, broadly populism.
right. These people they have more wealth. Some of them might have homes elsewhere. They've accumulated more wealth. They're on pensions. They don't have to live in the world that young French people have to live in. And furthermore, for those who are actually French stock, um, they don't really have. I mean, there's going to be a very bad future. Uh, Not unlike just about any Western country, if we're going to be honest, in the next 20 years. So, everybody could anticipate that she would be criticized for, a Russian bank basically giving her the power to park her money there because other banks wouldn't even do it. Um, so she's criticized for that, but I would say that the election is just a little bit over a week from now, and there's only two things. Like, the only thing that's going to come out of Donbass in eastern Ukraine is that Ukraine is losing. That's next week. That will be more apparent than it is now. Whether they find a French intelligence officer inside the steelworks in Mariupol or not, that's a fact. And if it is just a few mercenaries, that will be even worse for Macron. Right now, there's a much larger picture, and we've discussed on this show how after World War II, there was supposed to be a bilateral relationship between France and Germany. Uh, France would be the country that would have its own industry. Uh, France has always had a sophisticated industry, in automotive as well. But of course, Germany is an even, let's say, greater industrial power. But it was it was decided upon just after World War II that Germany would be the producer and France would be the consumer. Now, it's an oversimplification, but that was a bilateral relationship that was going to be formed,
Yes, the
and that's
European
how
Coal and
things.
Steel Pact, these very cursory deals to the European Union that would go on post Soviet Union to create a more unified bloc in Europe. But these economic interdependence deals were being made all across Europe, in particular France and Germany.
Right, exactly. So my uh, argument, of course, is you have Deutsche Bank who is in a panic and saying, if you do this, like the gas, if we don't get gas, um, if we have to go along with these American sanctions, we are going to face the worst possible inflation that we've had in half a century. We will be definitely in double digits. And in many cases, I don't think America cares. Like, I think America wants Germany to be less than even France.
And what is the cardinal question I have been asking for the last 2 months? I'll give the audience 5 seconds to think about it. How much pain is Europe willing to tolerate for the American
Yeah,
empire?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So what I'm saying is this: okay, so Macron wins. I mean, sorry, Le Pen wins, and I mean, it can't really partner up and form a bloc with Germany, as it kind of pretended it was doing. Let's say when we talk about the Minsk agreements, right? That's gone, right? I think we are now definitely in a second Cold War, with a hot war going on the border between these two blocks. And I don't know. I mean, I think this is America wants Europe to be financially crippled because then it will be more compliant. I mean, you see some of this dynamic already set in place in America very well. Like, America, in many cases, likes to print extra dollars because that devalues the dollar, which means China cannot take advantage of it. China has a lot of the most amount of American debt, and that value keeps going down,
And once
right?
again,
But it
as
comes at the expense of the average American.
as has been mentioned previously, Europe in a vacuum is of little to no value of America. What the American strategy in Europe is and has been for the past 75 years is depriving Europe from her rivals, depriving it from Russia, depriving it from China. So long as under the American thumb, there's nothing great of great significance they need out of Europe, whether that be a resource or strategic positioning. Sure, there are those things, and sure, those do lead to benefit. But the American Empire could certainly survive without them. There are much more vital interests abroad, as insofar as the imperial elite are concerned. But keeping Europe under occupation so it can't act as a bloc in and of itself or act in collaboration with
Yeah,
rival blocs is the utmost significance of NATO. Again, going back to that NATO slogan: Germans down, Americans in, Russians out.
exactly, exactly. So I mean, you can even see this was kind of in it was there during the Trump years as well. Um, People like to pretend that Trump was like somehow close to Russia, but like he was the first president to put sanctions on Russia. Sorry, sanctions on Nord Stream 2. He made a really big deal about his friendship in Poland. The Poles love Trump, right? And got along very well with the Hungarians. And he did
Oh
this
yes,
in
and
many
Poland and
ways in order to.
Hungary are having a spat over the Ukraine issue, or Poland has cut some diplomatic ties because of Hungary's closeness with Russia. That is also something to keep in mind, and that is also as
That's
Hungary
right.
grows closer to Serbia and the Balkan states.
Yeah, yeah. Um, they've been getting closer and closer for some time, and Serbia is surrounded on all sides, and a friend like Hungary could be very, very helpful to at least not have to worry about your eastern flank like that.
And Orban even went to
That's
bat
that's going to
with
be
for Serbia back in the 90s. He wasn't necessarily saying stop the intervention, but he said Hungary will have no part in it.
that's right. That's right. So what I'm basically saying is what kind of Europe is going to be left, whether Macron or Le Pen wins? Um, it's not going to be very easy at all because essentially America will have consolidated more power over Europe. Now, just as with Trump, no matter how fake the whole friendship with Russia was, I honestly thought Trump felt like he could play both. Uh, Trump is also the first president to give lethal weapons to Ukraine. Some will argue, it's he was trying to avoid avoid criticism for his administration. That's possible. I think it's more than that. Um, I mean, it could be that Trump was trying to, do an Erdogan move, but I tend to think he was not the great friend to Russia that people like to presume he was. Um, so I just don't know where this leaves. Where does this leave Europe? It doesn't leave it with like a lot of options. And as I said, they want Europe to be poorer. They want it to be more desperate, but they are afraid of the rhetoric. And Le Pen winning would be like dealing with Trump's rhetoric. The deep state in France would be against Le Pen in a very big way, just as the American deep state was against Trump.
Yes, and as the old saying goes, when the French sneeze, all of Europe catches a cold, to the point where Trump is an Atlantic Ocean away. Of course, his bombastic rhetoric, that doesn't really matter, except a few elements in Europe might pick that up. But when the French, one of the perceived leaders of Europe, when their electorate condones those ideas and that behavior, then many more countries, including Western European countries, are liable to become more sympathetic, if not outright adopt that behavior and those sorts of leaders for themselves.
Right. Like I do think that I do think they are afraid of like small blocks beginning to form. They're afraid of the rhetoric, and but it but one has to consider that impoverishing Europe to them might mean like a way to contain it, right? But that also stokes the fire. It is a kicking of the can strategy, but that is what they seem to be doing. Like they can't deal with any of the issues in America in an honest and open way. Whether you're talking about the borders, the rapid change in demographics, what's actually being taught to children in schools, I don't really see any breaks on that. So my brother laughing. He's a doomer just like us.
Yeah, yes,
Um,
you're listening to the potential replacement when our good friend here, Neville, gets liquidated by the CSIS, because we all know that's going to happen. I've done all I can for him. His connections in, of course, Russia have done all they can for him. You know, Vile Varangian, of course, is unfortunately missing in action. I know he's the infamous war criminal, and he was, you know, he was out there. He's been out there spearheading the war effort since
infamous war
2014.
criminal.
Okay, so I'll tell you, I'll just give you an overview of the chain of command. So okay, so it's Putin, then it's Dugin. You know who's above Dugin? That is Vile Varangian himself. Look, that's what they don't want you to know. I'm probably not allowed to say that on air, but the cat's out of the bag. Okay, everyone knows that. They've been trying to get him for years, and of course we're some of his close associates, so we're probably going to get gotten too. Probably not a good friend for me, but that's aside the point.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess to for myself, anyways, to sum up the French question, not a lot is going to change in Donbass. The direction that things are going will only accelerate to the way that they have been going, and that does not bode well for Macron. Uh, could that mean an upset? There was another right wing politician with like 2 or 3% of the vote. He too, like Zemmour, a little bit after Zemmour, but on the same day, um, asked his voters to vote for Le Pen. So they both endorsed Le Pen in that sense, and I think that was a kind of a test. Now, like I say, the victory will be on a rhetorical level, but that does accelerate the situation. Poverty will stop things on some level. Poverty in many ways will become an issue in order to stop the issue of culture and
Yes,
identity.
and once again, as much as they
And
don't
then
want to
rather than
admit it,
seeing like a right wing trend, is you will probably see something more like a left wing economic trend. But will that mean global homo will be put to pasture? No, I don't think so.
I would agree. And once again, just to drive home your point about the impoverishment of Europe, one could say continent-wide Morgenthau plan. Perhaps it's going a bit far, at least for now. But at the end of the day, I would say even your average European, while it may not even be conscious in some points, does know the score. They do know
Yeah,
that the Americans are in charge. And I'm not saying this to be a boastful American. I take no joy in reporting this. I do think that the
yeah,
American European relationship has been very toxic for both sides, one more so than another, but that's beside the point. But the average European does fundamentally understand that they are but a vassal of the American empire, and that Washington D.C. in some way or another does have final say over what they do with their country. And again, they may not like it. They may say a lot of things. They may have some residual anti-Americanism that, in some cases, may even manifest that the Americans aren't being good enough Americans themselves. But point being is, most Europeans at the end of the day have learned to accept that they are foreign subjects of an empire across the sea. And
yeah.
there is only really one way to break that, and that is going to require some pain. However, the question is, when that pain is inevitable either way, which it does seem to be, is it worth ripping off that band-aid, or is it worth just living with the status quo? Is the devil you know worse than the devil you don't know? They're an eternal question when it comes to these sort of situations. But with all that being said, I suppose we do have some news about Pakistan.
Yeah, we do. I would just like to just mention one or two more things about Europe, and that is like um, for Ukraine, but it kind of involves Europe as well, and that is, let's say the war goes on. Like I do think that the Russians eventually will accept like a NATO presence in Lvov, in Galicia, Ukraine, because I honestly, I could be wrong. I just don't see that the Russians want to patrol this vast area, this huge country. I know it's tiny compared to Russia, but it is a very large country. It is at least twice the size of France. It's enormous, and frankly, they don't have the resources. They don't have the army for it. And when, as you say, when America comes in, like, and they build a base, um, like, you pay for that, but you don't just pay for that. But America has uh, certain rights, certain sovereign rights over those military bases. Now, countries like Romania and Poland have already signed on to that. They don't seem to really care what the cost is. Also, the biggest Netflix office is going to be opened up very soon this spring, uh, in Poland. So they're going to get paused even more so. But Hungary is standing pretty strong. They're going to take a $7 billion hit. There's a $76 billion hit that's destined for Poland, but they've delayed that because of the enormous influx of Ukrainian migrants. So I just wanted to bring up those quick points about Europe and where it stands right now.
And once again, those are all good points. Europe will be one of the most pivotal, let's say, I wouldn't even say battlegrounds because I doubt we'll come to actual blows anytime soon. I could stand corrected within the next few years, who knows? But point being is, it will be one of those most pivotal grounds of struggle when it comes to determining what the world will look like in the 21st century. Once again, I am still on the record that 2022 so far is the most pivotal year and will determine the course of the rest of the decade, and not just the rest of the decade, the rest of the century. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But with that being said, also speaking of pivotal moves, Imran Khan has been ousted from Pakistan as prime minister. Now, this follows years of pro China and recently pro Russia policies on his part. Pakistan, once a steadfast American ally throughout the Cold War, in fact, they were the ones who did the groundwork, who did the heavy lifting for the American operation in Afghanistan in the 1980s and onward. Although they did have ties to the Taliban, they quickly found the line after 2001. Just mere days after the September 11th attacks, they were more than willing to facilitate an American invasion of the country. The ISI is one of the world's foremost intelligence agencies that people simply don't understand. You could say that the entirety of Pakistan is really run by the ISI, and uh, again, I don't think they get nearly enough credit for what they are. I would say they are one of the most dangerous organizations in the world, intelligence or not. And it does look like that Khan has been removed. Now, insofar as the internal power dynamics in Pakistan, I cannot claim to be an expert or even knowledgeable in them. What I do know is that he was very conciliatory towards China, recently Russia, and walked on some sort of nationalistic platform. And it got to the point where, even in recent weeks, you had Modi, the Prime Minister of India, of course, Pakistan's rival for the past 70 or so odd years, was praising Khan and vice versa, where it did look like there was going to be something of a reconciliation. And you've seen the American empire in recent years, I would say under the Trump administration, 2018, 2019 onward, really trying to ingratiate itself to India, trying to flip the dynamics of the previous Cold War with trying to put India squarely within the American bloc as Pakistan falls within the Chinese bloc. And it looks like India hasn't budged. There hasn't been really any significant moves against Modi, but it looks like Pakistan has budged and Khan is out of power. Now, how much this will actually impact the direction of Pakistan, I can't say for certain. It will at least be a morale blow that a yet another country fell to a color revolution. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it will be that significant because looking at the progress in relations between Pakistan and China, especially Russia to a lesser extent, over the past 7 odd years, it would be hard to do that just with one change of administration, just one change of leadership. Now, don't get me wrong, the CIA is still embedded in Pakistan. It is one of their main bases of operations and has been for years.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, they haven't been driven out. And that's also on top of its, let's just say, strange bedfellow relationship with the ISI because the ISI and CIA, talking about them as just sovereign organizations in and of themselves, aren't exactly friendly with each other, but they have more than enough enemies in common to be on a cooperative basis, just to put it that way. So, insofar as that's concerned, I don't know. Perhaps it does play into the recent American defeat in Afghanistan. Perhaps it does play into that as well as the ongoing issues with Russia and China. But the situation is very new. Many people are all over the place with it, whether this is a completely insignificant move or this has shown that Pakistan is now squarely back in the American sphere. I think it is still far too early to tell, but there are some interesting machinations in Pakistan, and it was a very quick color revolution. And now I don't know how long they had been planning to get Khan out of power because, of course, he was a very influential figure. You've been hearing about him for the past several years that he has been in office, and I remember that even going back to the 2016 election with some of the shenanigans there, the Pakistanis, now that's not to be confused with the other Khan who was one of the leakers, but the Pakistani government itself was accused of being one of these, again, third party countries that was used to play some shenanigans in the 2016 elections at least. But point being is Pakistan is just this hub uh, of several deep states actually, mainly the American
Yeah.
and the ISI, but it's lives up to its name as a former colonial nation. Now, of course, British influence has decreased markedly there, but don't get me wrong, what role British intelligence and the British deep state has there is still there to a degree, and that which has dissipated has been absorbed into the American sphere of influence. So I think people don't give Pakistan enough credit. And of course, keep in mind this is a country that does operate nukes, of course, unofficially, that is, along with India. But this country is a playground for some of the most secretive organizations in the world, and I think that is not to be overlooked.
Right. And the other thing to keep in mind about Pakistan is since 1947, it has had 18 prime ministers, and not one of them has ever finished office, ever. So, what happened to Imran Khan is not unusual. It is literally what has happened every single time. Whether they've been elected or appointed, none of them has ever finished a term.
So very similar to the
Uh,
Mediterranean states, I see.
like Ali Khan, he was assassinated in 1951. He was the first president. Uh, I mean, there are most of them just resigned because they were forced to resign, or the government was dissolved by the governor general. Um, but you get the picture. I'm not going to go into all of them. Uh,
Which now you understand why the
but
ISI has
a
been such
country that
a
is a
mainstay
country
in
that
ruling
is
the country.
yeah. I mean, exactly. Like it's literally like it's literally a deep state country, right? Um, it's just a pretense. So the other thing I think is, well, okay, so you can compare it to India in some ways, right? Like India and Pakistan both belong to the Shanghai Cooperative Agreement. And, does that mean like that's it? It's over? Uh, Pakistan's going to leave. Well, it's too early to tell, and my guess is that probably won't happen. Now, compared to India, well, I mean, India is part of the Quad. I honestly think there's just as great a chance of India leaving the Quad or being kicked out of the Quad than there is of Pakistan leaving the Shanghai Agreement. And the reason I say that is yet the third attempt to get India to change its policy about sanctions against Russia was just done this week. It seems like almost every week or every other week there's an effort. So Biden and Modi had a conference call, a Zoom call, if you will, and even Blinken showed up. And in both cases, no. Uh, Modi is not going to move on this. I I'm really quite surprised. So that leaves America, because America kind of like went out of its way to placate the Indians. You saw in 2020, they no longer called that region of the ocean, of the Pacific, the South Pacific. They call it what was it, the Indian Pacific, or the
Yes.
Indo-Pacific. Yeah, the Indo-Pacific, right? And like they just kind of pulled that out of thin air. Now, I know there were some areas that were already using that term, but they really worked overtime to popularize it, right? And that was to steal, like, you know references like the South China Sea to delegitimize. That's debatable. Does China have a right, like, to acquire and build these islands? But if we're going to be realist and apolitical geopolitical thinkers on this, it's an important point. And but India is not, it's not budging. And so that's why I say, how much of a shakeup is it? I kind of tend to think that this shakeup probably has a lot to do with the Taliban, because the Taliban recently met with Moscow, and Moscow is inching closer and closer to, more or less accepting them, recognizing them as the legitimate rulers of Afghanistan. And I think it's not just the war going on in Ukraine, that this is something that America cannot never completely let go of as far as Afghanistan goes, because it does not want Afghanistan to be this uh, transition, this important middle ground between China and Pakistan, particularly for oil and gas. So if you look at Iran, Iran sells oil and gas to Pakistan. Pakistan links it with Afghanistan. I mean, these are hypotheticals, right? Afghanistan does not have this yet, but then that pipeline conceivably would go into Afghanistan and into China, because it's that one little sliver. I forget the name of the pass that,
The Khyber Pass.
yeah, the Khyber Pass. It would go through there, and China would have, like, Iranian oil and gas. I mean, China already gets Iranian oil and gas, but this could be something that benefits China, but it would also benefit Afghanistan in terms that it would create transit fees, and it would create more infrastructure that could build the potential for more stability. But of course, they don't want certain parties don't want stability in that region at all, ever. And I mean, we did forget. I forgot to mention on the last show that, I mean, take it for what it is, but apparently, the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, apparently there was an assassination attempt. So, if you take it at face value,
Yes, there are many
Kazakhstan.
strange machinations in Central Asia for the time being, as to be expected. ever since, especially the attempted color revolution in Pakistan, but arguably going back even further with the attempted color revolution in Kyrgyzstan. But that's all I had for this week. If you have anything else,
I've got nothing else.
well, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. I know we gave you guys a little bit of a long episode this time around. I hope you guys enjoy it, and we will see you next episode. And goodbye.
Take care.